The morning of June 19th, 1943, broke grey and cold over the 8th Air Force Base at Thorpe Abbots, England. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Grow stood on the tarmac, surgical smock still stained from the previous night's emergency procedures, watching another formation of B-17 flying fortresses limp home from Germany. The aircraft came in ragged, their tight combat box formation long since shattered by German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Grow counted the returning bombers with the practiced eye of a man who had performed this grim arithmetic too many times. 23 had departed at dawn, 16 were coming back, 7 aircraft gone, with 70 young Americans either dead over Germany or falling through enemy skies in parachutes toward uncertain fates as prisoners of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But it was the returning bombers that demanded Grow's immediate attention. As each fortress touched down, ambulances roared across the field, their crews already knowing what awaited them. Grow climbed into the first vehicle, his hands instinctively checking his medical kit as they raced toward a B-17 that had barely made the runway. The bomber's aluminum skin was punctured with hundreds of holes, sunlight streaming through the fuselage like a sieve. Inside, the waist gunner lay unconscious, his flight suit dark with blood. A piece of German anti-aircraft shrapnel, no larger than a postage stamp, had entered just below his ribcage. Grow worked quickly, but he already knew the outcome. The fragment had found the boy's liver. At 42 years old, Malcolm Grow had seen death before. The Great War had taught him about the terrible mathematics of industrial combat, about what high explosives and machine guns could do to human flesh. But this was different. These weren't soldiers advancing across shell-cratered fields with some chance to take cover or retreat. These were young men trapped in aluminum tubes at 25,000 feet, completely exposed to a steel storm they could neither avoid nor escape. Each mission was a gauntlet through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and the human cost was becoming unbearable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By late afternoon, Grow had operated on 11 crew members. 8 would survive, though several would never fly again. 3 died on the operating table despite everything military medicine could offer. As Grow removed his surgical gloves and washed the blood from his hands, he studied the collection of metal fragments he'd extracted that day. 17 pieces in total, arranged on a sterile tray like evidence at a crime scene. The largest was the size of a quarter, the smallest barely visible to the naked eye, yet each one had been traveling fast enough to punch through aircraft aluminum, through leather flight jackets, through human skin and muscle and bone. What haunted Grow most was the preventability of it all. These weren't wounds from enemy fighter cannons or machine gun bullets. Those killed instantly or not at all. These fragments came from German 88mm anti-aircraft shells that exploded around bomber formations, sending hundreds of metal shards in all directions. According to the records Grow had been keeping, 70% of bomber crew casualties resulted from these relatively low-velocity fragments. Fragments that travelled slowly enough that basic armour could stop them. The solution seemed obvious to a surgeon who had spent months pulling metal from young bodies. If these men wore protective plates over their vital organs, most would never reach his operating table. That evening, Grow sat in his quarters reviewing the casualty documentation aimed by the 8th Air Force surgical consultants. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter. Most lethal fragments weighed less than 1 ounce and penetrated less than 2 inches into human tissue. The Army had issued steel helmets to ground troops since the previous war. Tank crews wore armour. Naval personnel served behind steel bulkheads. Yet somehow the Air Force had decided that bomber crews flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire needed no such protection. The official reasoning, when Grow had inquired, was that armour would add weight to the aircraft, reduce performance, and undermine crew morale by suggesting vulnerability. Grow made a decision that night that would violate protocol, bypass official channels, and potentially end his military career. He would build body armour himself, using whatever resources he could commandeer or improvise. If the system wouldn't protect these young men, he would find another way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. July 7th, 1943, arrived with the perpetual drizzle that characterized English summers. Rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof of the aircraft salvage depot, where Malcolm Grow had established his clandestine operation. The facility officially existed to strip damaged bombers for spare parts. Unofficially, it had become Grow's laboratory for an experiment that military regulations explicitly prohibited. Earlier that year, the Army Air Forces had conducted official tests on body armor prototypes and concluded they were impractical. The weight penalty reduced aircraft performance, engineers had argued. The psychological burden of wearing armor undermined crew morale, psychologists had claimed. Most damningly, procurement officers calculated that manufacturing armor for hundreds of thousands of airmen would drain resources better spent on building more bombers. The official memorandum had been unambiguous. Individual protective equipment development for aircrew was not a priority. Grow had read that memo, crumpled it, and thrown it into the waste bin where it belonged. His unofficial research team consisted of volunteers who worked after their regular duties ended. Captain Robert Morgan, a pilot who had survived 24 missions through sheer luck and now wanted to improve those odds for others. Technical Sergeant William Patterson, an aircraft mechanic with an intuitive understanding of metal properties and access to welding equipment. Second Lieutenant James Kendrick, a young engineer from Detroit who had worked at Ford Motor Company before the war and understood mass production principles. And Corporal Thomas Chen, a ballistics specialist who could calculate exactly how much steel thickness was required to stop specific threats. They began by studying the evidence written in aluminum and blood. Grow had been collecting flak fragments from wounded men for months, cataloguing each piece with medical precision. The fragments ranged from jagged shards no bigger than a fingernail to twisted chunks the size of silver dollars. Patterson helped analyze damaged aircraft, mapping where defensive fire had penetrated fuselages. The patterns revealed that most lethal hits struck crew members in the chest and abdomen while they sat at their stations, operating guns, navigating, or managing flight systems. Chen performed ballistic tests using a makeshift firing range established behind the salvage depot. They mounted steel plates of varying thickness on wooden frames and fired captured German shell fragments at different velocities. The results were encouraging. 12-gauge manganese steel, the same material used in military helmets, could stop the majority of flak fragments when properly shaped and angled. The challenge was creating something airmen could actually wear for 8-hour missions at altitude in sub-zero temperatures. The early prototypes were complete disasters. The first vest weighed 42 pounds and restricted movement so severely that test subjects could barely reach their instrument panels or gun controls. The second version used overlapping steel plates that rattled loudly enough to interfere with radio communication, potentially fatal when coordination between aircraft was essential for survival. The third design distributed weight poorly, causing severe back pain after just 20 minutes of wear. Grow refused to accept failure. He spent nights sketching designs by lamplight, trying to synthesize everything he knew about human anatomy, weight distribution, and the medieval armor he had studied in medical school when learning about historical battlefield injuries. The answer came from an unexpected source. Knights had solved similar problems 5 centuries earlier, protecting vital organs while maintaining mobility through careful articulation and strategic placement of metal plates. The breakthrough design emerged in late August. They created a vest using overlapping manganese steel plates, each approximately 8 inches square and 1/8 of an inch thick, arranged in a pattern that protected the heart, lungs, and major blood vessels. The plates were mounted on canvas, backing with leather straps that distributed weight across the shoulders and waist. Total weight, 22 pounds, heavy but bearable. The vest could be worn over standard flight suits and didn't interfere with parachute harnesses or oxygen equipment. Now came the truly dangerous part, convincing airmen to test it in actual combat without official authorization. September 3, 1943, began before dawn when Staff Sergeant Paul Bradley stood in the briefing room, learning that his bomb group would be attacking the industrial facilities at Stuttgart, Germany, a target deep in enemy territory that promised heavy resistance. At 20 years old, Bradley had already completed 11 missions as a waist gunner aboard the B-17 nicknamed Memphis Belle II, but the knot in his stomach never went away. Statistics offered no comfort. Bomber crews had roughly a 50-50 chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour of duty. After the briefing, Bradley returned to his barracks and found an unusual package on his bunk. Inside was a heavy canvas vest lined with steel plates, along with a handwritten note from Colonel Grow. "This is experimental, completely voluntary. It might save your life. It might do nothing, but I believe it's worth trying." The note included no official stamps, no command authority, no paperwork trail. Just a surgeon's personal appeal to give his invention a chance. Bradley held the vest, feeling its substantial weight. His first thought was practical. Would this thing drag him down if he had to bail out over Germany? His second thought was darker. Did it even matter? Most men who bailed out over enemy territory ended up in prisoner-of-war camps anyway, assuming they survived the parachute descent through German fighters and ground fire. His third thought was the one that decided him. Maybe this vest could bring him home alive. Bradley wore the vest under his flight suit and said nothing to his crewmates during the pre-flight check. The ritual of preparation had its own rhythm, checking oxygen masks, testing intercoms, loading ammunition belts into the 50-caliber machine guns that were their only defense against enemy fighters. The vest felt awkward at first, restricting his movement slightly, but adrenaline made him forget the discomfort once Memphis Belle II lifted off from Thorpe Abbots at 0600 hours. The bomber formation climbed through scattered clouds, assembling into the combat box formation that provided mutual defensive fire coverage. Bradley took his position at the waist gun, surrounded by the thin aluminum skin that separated him from 30,000 feet of altitude and temperatures far below zero. Through the open gun port, England disappeared below, replaced by the English Channel's grey waters. The German border brought the first enemy fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s that tore through the formation with cannon fire blazing. Bradley fired his machine gun in controlled bursts, the weapon's vibration travelling up his arms. Hot brass casings bounced around the aircraft interior. Smoke from gun barrels created an acrid haze that mixed with the smell of cordite and fear. The intercom crackled with urgent warnings. Bandits at 3 o'clock high. Lead bomber is hit, fighters breaking left. Then came the flak. German anti-aircraft batteries opened up as the formation approached Stuttgart. Black puffs of smoke materialized around the bombers like evil flowers blooming in an empty sky. Each puff represented an 88mm shell exploding at precisely calculated altitude, sending hundreds of fragments in all directions. The noise was tremendous, a constant hammering that made the aircraft shudder and filled the air with the smell of explosive propellant. Bradley felt the impacts before he heard them. Shrapnel punched through Memphis Belle II's aluminum skin with sounds like hammers striking tin cans. Fragments whistled past his head. One piece tore through his flight suit sleeve without touching skin. Pure luck. Another fragment slammed into his chest with the force of a baseball bat swung by an invisible giant. The impact knocked him backward, stealing his breath, and for a terrifying moment Bradley was certain he had been killed, that he was experiencing those final seconds of consciousness before death claimed him. But then he drew a painful breath, and another, and realized he was still alive. The steel plate had stopped the fragment completely. Through the torn flight suit, he could see the indentation in the metal where the shrapnel had struck and been defeated. 3 more hits struck his torso during the bomb run. Each impact hurt like being punched by an invisible fist, but none penetrated the armor. When Memphis Belle II finally landed back at Thorpe Abbots 8 hours later, Bradley climbed out on shaking legs and found Colonel Grow waiting on the tarmac. September 15, 1943, brought Malcolm Grow his first concrete proof that the steel vest worked, though the evidence came at a terrible price. 3 B-17 seconds from the raid on Stuttgart hadn't returned, and 2 others landed with critically wounded crew members aboard. But Staff Sergeant Bradley walked away without a scratch, despite taking multiple hits that would have been fatal without protection. The dented vest became Grove's most persuasive argument for the armor program. He photographed the damage from every angle, documenting each impact point with clinical precision. The largest fragment had struck directly over Bradley's heart, with enough force to create a deep crater in the steel plate. According to Chen's ballistic analysis, that fragment would have penetrated approximately 6 inches into unprotected flesh. A death sentence. 2 other strikes had targeted the lungs, 1 the liver. Any single hit would have been catastrophic. Word spread through the bomber squadrons faster than official orders ever traveled. Airmen were superstitious by nature, carrying lucky coins and wearing the same underwear on every mission for good fortune. But here was something tangible that had demonstrably saved a man's life. Within days, Grove's workshop was besieged by volunteers requesting vests for their next mission. The problem was production capacity. His small team could only manufacture 3 or 4 vests per day, and the 8th Air Force had hundreds of bombers flying missions continuously. Captain Morgan proposed a solution that was both brilliant and completely unauthorized. They would begin salvaging steel plates from damaged aircraft that arrived daily at repair depots. German cannon shells and flak had already done the work of cutting metal into manageable pieces. Patterson's welding crew could reshape these fragments, tempering them properly and mounting them on canvas backing purchased through creative interpretation of supply requisitions. It was battlefield improvisation elevated to an art form. By October, Grove's operation had expanded beyond anything he had initially imagined. The salvage depot ran 24 hours a day with different shifts working in coordination. Day crews stripped damaged bombers, sorting metal by quality and thickness. Evening crews cut and shaped plates, working under blackout conditions that made the dangerous task even more treacherous. Night crews assembled vests, stitching canvas and riveting straps with numbed fingers in unheated workshops. Historical records maintained by the 8th Air Force, documentation later preserved in the National Archives, show that 47 vests were distributed to air crews during October 1943. These early models were crude compared to later production versions, but they shared the essential design, overlapping manganese steel plates protecting vital organs, mounted on a vest that could be worn with standard flight equipment. The results were undeniable and began accumulating with each mission. Lieutenant Charles Anderson took a flak fragment to the chest during a raid on Bremen that would have severed his aorta. The steel plate stopped it cold, leaving Anderson with only a massive bruise that made breathing painful for weeks but allowed him to survive. Technical Sergeant Robert Williams survived 3 direct hits during the bloody Schweinfurt raid in October, where the bomber force suffered catastrophic losses that nearly ended the daylight bombing campaign. Sergeant Donald Murphy's vest stopped a fragment that would have struck his spine, leaving him paralyzed. Each survival story created another believer in Grove's unauthorized armor program, but success brought its own complications. The production operation had grown too large to remain secret from military bureaucracy. Supply sergeants started asking pointed questions about missing materials. Inspector generals noted discrepancies in salvage reports that didn't match official documentation. Most problematic, bomber crews were making unauthorized modifications to equipment, which violated multiple regulations governing standardized gear. The bureaucratic walls were closing in, and Grove knew that official discovery could shut down the entire operation before it could be legitimized. He needed to convert his underground innovation into an official program before the system crushed it. In late October, Grove compiled his evidence into a comprehensive report that ran to 43 pages. He included photographs of damaged vests showing exactly where fragments had struck, sworn statements from survivors describing how the armor had saved their lives, statistical analysis of casualty rates among vest-wearing crews versus unprotected crews flying the same missions, ballistic test results demonstrating the steel's effectiveness against various fragment types and velocities. The data was overwhelming and irrefutable. Airmen wearing the steel vests had a 73% lower rate of fatal torso wounds compared to unprotected crew members on identical missions to the same targets. Grow submitted his report through official channels, addressing it directly to Major General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force. The cover letter was carefully worded, acknowledging the unauthorized nature of the project while emphasizing the life-saving results that couldn't be ignored. He requested formal authorization to continue production and proposed expanding the program to protect all bomber crews before winter weather made the air war even more deadly. Then came the waiting, while young men continued dying in the sky above Europe, and Grow wondered if his military career was about to end in disgrace. November 9th, 1943, arrived with a summons that Malcolm Grow had been dreading. A staff car appeared at Thorpe Abbots base before sunrise, delivering orders for Grow to report immediately to 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. The tone was ominous, no explanation provided, just a direct command from the commanding general's office. Grow rode in silence, watching the English countryside pass by through rain-streaked windows, knowing that his career might be ending before the day was done. The headquarters complex buzzed with the controlled chaos of war management. Officers hurried through corridors carrying classified documents marked with red security stamps. Telephones rang constantly with updates from bomber groups scattered across England. Wall maps showed the dispositions of hundreds of aircraft with coloured pins marking targets deep in occupied Europe. Grow was escorted directly to General Eaker's office, bypassing the usual waiting areas. Never a good sign in military protocol. Major General Ira Eaker sat behind his desk with Grow's report open before him. At 57 years old, Eaker had the weathered look of a man carrying impossible responsibilities. He commanded thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men engaged in the strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to cripple Germany's war production capacity. Every decision he made involved calculated risks with human lives as the currency. The general's face revealed nothing as Grow stood at attention. "Colonel Grow," Eaker began without preamble, "you've created quite a problem for me." Grow stood rigid, saying nothing. In the military, there was no good response to such an opening statement. Eaker continued, his voice measured and deliberate. "You conducted unauthorized research. You diverted military materials without proper requisition forms. You manufactured equipment that violated existing policy directives. You distributed that equipment to combat personnel without safety certification or official approval. You did all of this while ignoring explicit orders that body armor development was not a priority for the Air Force." He paused, letting the weight of those violations settle in the room like physical objects. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "Yes, sir," Grow replied, meeting the general's eyes. "I saved lives." The blunt response hung in the air between them. Eaker's expression revealed nothing, but he gestured for Grow to sit, a small mercy that suggested the conversation might be more nuanced than a simple disciplinary action. "Your report is compelling," Eaker admitted, closing the folder with deliberate care. 73% reduction in fatal torso wounds is statistically significant. Your documentation is thorough and professionally prepared. The testimony from surviving crew members is powerful. He paused, standing to walk to the window overlooking the grey English sky. "But you've put me in an impossible position, Colonel. If I endorse your vests, I'm validating insubordination. Every officer in the 8th Air Force will think they can ignore regulations if they believe they know better than the system. That's how military discipline collapses." Grow leaned forward in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "General, respectfully, I don't care about my career or my reputation. Court-martial me if necessary. Strip my rank, but please don't shut down the vest program. These boys are dying from wounds that don't have to be fatal. Every single day we delay production is another day that crew members go into combat unprotected against threats we know how to stop." Eaker turned from the window, his expression troubled. "The Pentagon has concerns beyond your immediate observations, Colonel. Weight affects aircraft performance in ways you may not have considered. Every pound of armor reduces bomb load capacity or fuel range. Engineering studies from Wright Field indicate that widespread armor adoption could reduce our overall bombing effectiveness by 15%. Is saving individual lives worth degrading our strategic capabilities?" and potentially prolonging the war. "The Pentagon's engineering studies are wrong, sir," Grow responded, pulling out additional documents he had prepared for exactly this argument. "We've tracked the combat performance of vest-equipped aircraft versus standard configuration bombers on the same missions. There's no measurable difference in bombing accuracy, combat radius, or formation-keeping ability. 22 pounds distributed properly across a crew doesn't significantly impact a 30,000-pound aircraft. The theoretical models don't account for real-world conditions." Ika returned to his desk, clearly wrestling with the decision. "And what about morale? The Army psychologists argue that armor makes men more cautious, less aggressive in combat. That wearing protection is an admission of vulnerability that undermines fighting spirit. They cite historical examples of how defensive mindsets lead to defeats." Grow couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. "General, I've operated on enough of these boys to know exactly how vulnerable they are. The vest doesn't make them scared or cautious. It makes them hopeful. Hope is what keeps them climbing back into those bombers mission after mission when the mathematics say they shouldn't survive. Hope is what maintains morale when they've watched their friends die in burning aircraft. The psychologists are theorizing from offices in Washington. I'm reporting from operating rooms in England. According to historical accounts compiled by military historians and referenced in official 8th Air Force historical records, Ika faced intense pressure from multiple directions during this period. The Pentagon wanted standardization and centralized control over all equipment development. Procurement officers resented field modifications that bypassed their authority and disrupted their carefully managed supply chains. But Ika also had casualty reports on his desk showing that bomber losses were approaching unsustainable levels that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Grow, Ika spoke. "I'm going to authorize a formal trial program. You'll produce 100 additional vests using proper requisition channels and official documentation. We'll track results over the next month with rigorous statistical analysis. If the data supports your claims as strongly as you believe, I'll recommend full adoption to the Pentagon and argue for immediate production. If the results are inconclusive, or if the vests create operational problems, the program ends immediately and you'll face an official inquiry into your unauthorized activities." It wasn't everything Grow had wanted, but it was enough to continue. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, Colonel," Ika replied. "You've just volunteered yourself for a bureaucratic nightmare that will make combat operations look simple." December 1st, 1943, marked the beginning of Malcolm Grow's second battle, one fought not against German Flak, but against the grinding machinery of military procurement and bureaucracy. The authorization for his trial program came with conditions that threatened to strangle the innovation with administrative red tape. Every vest required documentation tracing materials from source to finished product. Every steel plate needed provenance tracking showing it came from approved suppliers. Every design modification demanded written approval through multiple channels of command. The system that Grow had bypassed with his unauthorized operation now wrapped around him like chains. The immediate challenge was scaling production from 4 vests per day to numbers that could protect meaningful portions of bomber crews flying increasingly dangerous missions. Grow's informal team of volunteers working with salvaged materials in a drafty workshop needed to transform into something resembling an actual manufacturing operation with quality control and accountability. But the military bureaucracy moved with the speed of continental drift, and men were dying while paperwork circulated through distant offices. Lieutenant Kendrick, the young engineer from Detroit, proposed adapting automobile assembly line techniques to vest production. Henry Ford had revolutionized manufacturing by breaking complex production into simple, repeatable steps performed by specialized workers. The same principles could apply to armor manufacturing, but implementation required resources, factory space, specialized equipment, and most elusive of all, official approval for requisitions that could take months to process. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The breakthrough came from an unexpected ally. Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, had lost 32 aircraft in a single disastrous mission to Oschersleben in January. The casualties haunted him in ways that other officers couldn't understand. When he learned about Grove's vest program and saw the statistical evidence of its effectiveness, Castle became its most powerful advocate within the command structure. Using his authority and political capital, Castle commandeered a requisitioned British factory building near Cambridge and assigned it exclusively to vest production. The facility had previously manufactured aircraft components for the Royal Air Force, so it already contained the necessary industrial equipment: metal presses, cutting tools, welding stations, assembly benches. By mid-December, Grove's operation occupied 15,000 square feet of factory space with a civilian workforce supplementing military personnel. British women, many of whom had lost husbands or sons to the war, volunteered for the production work with fierce determination. They understood intimately what the vests meant for someone's survival. Mrs. Eleanor Chapman, whose Royal Air Force pilot son had been killed over France in 1941, worked the riveting stations with intensity that impressed even veteran machinists. "If these vests protect someone's boy," she told Grove during an inspection visit, "then my son's death means something. That purpose keeps me going when nothing else does." The production line began taking organized shape. Station 1 cut canvas backing to standardized patterns using industrial cutting machines. Station 2 shaped steel plates using hydraulic presses, far more efficient and consistent than hand hammering. Station 3 assembled the overlapping plate arrangement, following precise templates that ensured consistent coverage of vital organs. Station 4 attached adjustable straps and quick-release buckles. Station 5 conducted rigorous quality inspection, rejecting any vest with gaps in protection or faulty construction that could fail under combat conditions. But materials remained the constant obstacle, threatening to halt everything. The British economy had been stripped to bare essentials by 4 years of total war. Steel was allocated by government priority for ships, tanks, and aircraft construction, not for personal armour that the official military procurement system still hadn't fully endorsed beyond Grove's limited trial. His requisitions disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, while production lines sat idle, and bomber crews continued flying unprotected. Patterson, the resourceful aircraft mechanic, suggested they source materials locally rather than waiting months for official channels to process paperwork. Damaged aircraft continued arriving at repair depots every single day. Each wrecked bomber contained hundreds of pounds of high-quality manganese steel that would otherwise be melted down for scrap recycling. If they could intercept that material before it entered the official salvage system, they could maintain continuous production without waiting for distant bureaucrats. It required creative interpretation of regulations that made Grove deeply uncomfortable. He was by nature and medical training a man who followed established rules and procedures, but the rules were getting men killed through institutional inertia. He authorized Patterson's salvage operations with the full understanding that if it ended his career, the sacrifice would be worth it for the lives saved. By late December, the production line was manufacturing 25 vests daily, and quality was improving with each iteration as workers gained experience. The design itself evolved through practical feedback from air crews who wore the armor in actual combat. Gunners reported that the original shoulder straps interfered with weapon traversing when tracking fast-moving fighters. So Grove's team redesigned the mounting system with offset attachment points. Bombardiers found the standard vest too bulky for the confined spaces of the nose compartment where they worked. This led to a modified version with slightly smaller plates that still protected vital organs. Radio operators requested additional protection for the sides of the torso where they sat exposed to lateral fire, which was incorporated into an updated design. According to documentation from the period, records that would later be cited in academic studies of military innovation and field adaptation, the Grove vest, as airmen called it, went through 18 distinct design revisions during December 1943 alone. Each improvement was driven by combat experience rather than theoretical engineering conducted in distant laboratories. The men who wore the vests in battle against German defences became de facto test pilots for life-saving equipment, and their survival feedback drove continuous refinement. The trial program's 100 vest milestone was reached on December 28th. Every vest was immediately issued to crew members, flying the most dangerous deep penetration missions into Germany, where flak concentrations were heaviest and fighter opposition most intense. Grow insisted on comprehensive tracking that would satisfy even the most skeptical Pentagon analysts. Each vest was numbered and catalogued, each wearer documented with name, rank, and assignment. Each mission recorded with target, altitude, and defensive fire encountered. Now came the crucial 30-day period where accumulated data would determine whether official adoption happened or the entire program was shut down permanently. January 6, 1944, brought the kind of mission that filled combat veterans with dread and gave new crew members nightmares for years afterward if they survived. The target was the industrial complex at Oschersleben, Germany, which meant flying 400 miles into hostile territory through the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses the Luftwaffe could concentrate. Weather conditions were marginal, with thick cloud cover that would scatter bomber formations, eliminating the mutual protective fire that made survival possible against determined fighter attacks. First Lieutenant David Richards, pilot of the B-17 Dakota Queen, attended the pre-dawn briefing with his crew and felt his stomach tighten when the target was revealed on the operations map. The intelligence officer's description was clinical and understated. Bomb group altitude 26,000 feet. Expected flak, heavy, and accurate. Estimated fighter opposition severe throughout the mission profile. But everyone in that crowded briefing room knew the real translation. This mission would be bloody, with losses that might approach the catastrophic Schweinfurt raids that had nearly broken the 8th Air Force. Richards's crew had flown 17 missions together, enough to develop the wordless coordination that separated professional crews from those who didn't survive their first 5 combat trips. They wore their GROW vests without discussion or comment, the steel plates having become as routine as parachutes and oxygen masks despite still carrying no official Army Air Force designation numbers. Nobody cared about paperwork when your life was measured in fractions of inches between shrapnel fragments and vital organs. The takeoff happened in darkness with 73 B-17 seconds from 3 bomb groups assembling into formation by following radio beacons through the clouds. Dakota Queen climbed through the overcast, ice forming dangerously on the wings until they reached clear air above the weather. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a powerful aerial armada carrying American industrial might toward the enemy's heartland. It should have been inspiring, but every veteran knew the price that would be paid before they saw England again. The German border brought the first fighters precisely on schedule. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hit the formation from multiple angles in coordinated attacks that showed the Luftwaffe's increasing tactical sophistication. Richards's crew had learned through bitter experience that German pilots targeted any bomber showing weakness. An engine trailing smoke, a lagging aircraft falling behind formation, a bomber with visible damage. These attracted predators instantly, like sharks sensing blood in water. Dakota Queen maintained position through sheer force of will and excellent engineering. Then, approaching the target, the flak began in earnest. The German 88mm batteries had become terrifyingly proficient through years of practice. They predicted bomber altitudes with mathematical accuracy, adjusted for wind drift and formation speed, and created boxes of explosive steel that bomber formations had to fly directly through to reach their targets. Richards watched black clouds of detonation materialize at exact altitude, feeling Dakota Queen shudder violently as fragments hammered the aircraft's skin like deadly hail. The bombardier called corrections over the crackling intercom, making final adjustments for the bomb run. This was the worst part of every mission. Flying straight and level, absolutely predictable, giving German gunners a perfect target while the bombardier lined up the crosshairs on the aiming point. 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours of exposure. Flak bursts walked closer as gunners bracketed the formation with professional precision. Then the bombardier's voice, tense but controlled. Bombs away. Dakota Queen lurched upward as 8,000 pounds of high explosives dropped toward the factories below, the sudden weight loss making the bomber jump. Richards immediately banked hard left, breaking formation to present a moving target while flak continued filling the sky with deadly fragments. In the waist gun position, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres felt multiple impacts hammer against his vest in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3 separate strikes in the span of 5 seconds. Each hit drove the air from his lungs with shocking force. The steel plates absorbed the fragment's kinetic energy, but the transfer felt like being kicked repeatedly by an invisible mule. Torres kept his gun active, firing controlled bursts at a Fokker Wolf making a head-on pass, and only later realized how close he had come to death without the armor. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant William Morrison, wasn't as fortunate despite his protection. A large flak fragment struck his position low, and while his vest protected his torso completely, the shrapnel tore through his leg above the knee. Morrison's screams filled the intercom until the co-pilot shut off his channel and scrambled back to render first aid with the limited medical supplies aboard. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but Morrison would never fly combat missions again, his war ending in that moment of tearing metal and bone. Throughout the bomber formation, similar stories repeated themselves with minor variations. The B-17 Iron Lady took 47 flak hits, with 5 crew members struck by fragments. 4 were wearing vests and survived with painful bruises and broken ribs that would heal. The 5th crew member, who hadn't received a vest due to supply shortages, died instantly when a fragment penetrated his chest cavity and destroyed his heart. Memphis Belle 3 lost an engine to concentrated flak, but made it back to England because both the pilot and co-pilot, protected by vests, continued flying despite taking multiple hits to their torsos that would otherwise have been fatal. The mission cost the 8th Air Force 9 bombers lost outright with 63 crew members killed or missing over Germany. But casualty analysis told a compelling story that vindicated GROW's unauthorized program. Among crew members wearing GROW vests, the fatal torso wound rate was 81% lower than historical averages for missions of similar intensity and duration. According to documentation compiled by GROW's expanding medical team, records that would later be published in military medical journals, the vest program had saved approximately 37 lives during that single horrific mission to Oschersleben. When Dakota Queen landed at Thorpe Abbots 7 hours after takeoff, Richards's crew climbed out on shaking legs that could barely support their weight. They found Malcolm Grow waiting on the tarmac, as he always did, to personally collect damaged vests for analysis. Torres's vest had 3 deep craters in the steel plates, any one of which would have been fatal without protection. Morrison was already en route to the base hospital, where Grow's surgical team would save his leg despite the severe damage, though his flying days were permanently finished. That night, Grow compiled his mission report with hands that trembled from exhaustion and emotion. The data was undeniable and overwhelming, but he knew from hard experience that data alone wouldn't be enough to overcome institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia. February 14, 1944, brought Malcolm Grow to Washington, District of Columbia, summoned before a committee of generals and procurement officials who would decide the final fate of body armor for bomber crews. The timing was deliberate. Valentine's Day, when American families across the nation would be thinking about loved ones serving far from home in dangerous places. Grow carried a battered steel vest under one arm and a thick folder of documentation under the other, prepared to fight the most important battle of his entire career. The hearing took place deep inside the Pentagon, that massive 5-sided building that had only been completed 2 years earlier and already housed the sprawling bureaucratic machinery of global war. Grow sat at a small table facing a panel of 7 officers, all of whom significantly outranked him, all of whom had the power to end his vest program with a simple majority vote. The room smelled of furniture polish and cigarette smoke, and the accumulated tension of 1,000 difficult decisions that determined men's fates. Colonel Harrison Gerhardt, representing the Army Air Force's Procurement Division, opened the proceedings by methodically outlining the case against widespread body armor adoption. His presentation was polished and professional, delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who believed statistical models told the complete story better than messy reality. The proposed widespread adoption of the Grow vest presents several critical concerns that this committee must carefully weigh, Gerhardt began, his pointer tapping a series of elaborate charts mounted on easels. First, weight penalty and performance degradation. Each vest adds 22 pounds to aircraft load. Across a typical 1,000-bomber raid, that's 11 tons of steel that could instead be 11 tons of additional bombs, on target. Second, Production costs and resource allocation. Manufacturing sufficient vests for all bomber crews would require diverting high-grade steel from tank production, artillery shell manufacturing, and naval vessel construction. Third, the psychological impact of officially admitting that our aircraft don't adequately protect their crews may undermine recruitment efforts and public confidence in our air campaign. Grow listened to each carefully constructed argument, recognizing the bureaucratic logic that prioritized abstract systems over individual human beings. When his turn finally came to present his case, he stood deliberately and placed the damaged vest on the conference table, where every committee member could clearly see the battle damage. Gentlemen, this vest belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 20 years old, from Texas, serving as a waist gunner on the Oschersleben raid last month. He took 3 direct flak hits during the bomb run over the target. Grow pointed to the distinct craters in the steel plates with a surgeon's precise finger. This impact would have destroyed his heart, killing him instantly. This one would have severed his pulmonary artery, causing him to bleed out in minutes at 25,000 feet. This third strike would have punctured both lungs, drowning him in his own blood. He pulled out a recent photograph showing Torres standing beside Dakota Queen, young and alive and smiling. Instead, Sergeant Torres walked away from that mission without a scratch. He flew another combat mission 3 days later. He's completed 21 missions now and is still protecting his bomber against German fighters. The vest saved his life, and his continued service has helped save the lives of his entire crew by defending their aircraft. Grow distributed thick folders to each committee member containing meticulously organized data from 3 months of intensive combat operations. The statistics are unambiguous and statistically significant, gentlemen. Among vest-equipped crews, we've documented an 81% reduction in fatal torso wounds compared to unprotected crews flying identical missions to the same targets. That translates to approximately 300 American lives saved just since this trial program began in December. These aren't theoretical projections or laboratory estimates. These are American airmen who are alive today, writing letters to their families because of steel plates and canvas backing. Major General Barney Giles, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff and one of the most powerful officers in the room, raised his hand for recognition. Colonel Grow, nobody here disputes that your vests save individual lives in specific instances. The question we must answer is strategic impact across the entire air campaign. If weight penalty reduces our overall bombing effectiveness even marginally, we might prolong the war by months and ultimately cost more total lives than we save through personal protection. How do you respond to that argument? Grow was prepared for exactly this line of reasoning. Sir, we've systematically compared mission performance data between vest-equipped aircraft and standard configuration bombers operating on the same raids. There is no statistically measurable difference in bombing accuracy, fuel consumption rates, or mechanical reliability. The 22-pound weight is distributed across multiple crew members, not concentrated in a way that affects aircraft center of gravity or performance characteristics. The engineering studies from Wright Field predicting a 15% effectiveness reduction were based entirely on theoretical models that don't account for actual combat conditions and real-world operations. He pulled out additional documentation, mission reports signed by squadron commanders, independent engineering analyses from Boeing and other aircraft manufacturers. Boeing's chief engineers reviewed our complete dataset and concluded definitively that the weight impact is negligible within the B-17's substantial design safety margins. The Flying Fortress was engineered with excess capacity specifically to handle battlefield modifications. 22 pounds per aircraft doesn't approach the threshold where performance degradation becomes operationally measurable. The procurement officer tried a different angle of attack. What about production capacity and steel allocation? This is a zero-sum equation, Colonel. Every pound of steel diverted to your vests is steel not going into tanks, ships, or additional aircraft. How do you justify that resource trade-off in a global war where material shortages affect every theatre? Respectfully, sir, that argument is based on flawed assumptions about our material sourcing. Grow responded calmly. We're primarily using salvaged steel from damaged aircraft that return to repair depots. Every wrecked bomber contains enough high-quality manganese steel to produce 12 complete vests. We're reclaiming material that would otherwise be melted down for generic scrap recycling. The net impact on primary steel production for new manufacturing is minimal to non-existent. According to historical accounts preserved in official Air Force archives, documentation that would later be extensively cited in academic studies of military innovation and organizational adaptation under wartime pressure, the hearing continued for nearly 6 hours. Grow defended every single aspect of his program against increasingly skeptical and detailed questioning. The committee demanded empirical evidence for every claim, rigorous statistics for every assertion, and complete justification for every design choice and production decision. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction that changed the entire tenor of the debate. Brigadier General Curtis LeMay, known throughout the Air Force for his ruthless pragmatism and absolute willingness to challenge orthodox thinking, asked a devastatingly simple question that cut through all the bureaucratic complexity. Colonel Grow, if you were a 20-year-old bombardier facing 25 combat missions over heavily defended German targets, would you personally want to wear one of these vests? Without hesitation, sir. Absolutely yes. Then that's sufficient for me, LeMay said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. We cannot in good conscience ask young American men to risk their lives in our strategic bombing campaign and then deliberately deny them protection that we know will save their lives. That's not military efficiency or proper resource allocation. That's institutional cowardice dressed up in cost-benefit analysis and statistical models. The conference room went completely silent. LeMay's support carried enormous weight throughout the command structure, and his willingness to frame the entire debate in stark moral terms, rather than purely tactical calculations, shifted the conversation's foundation. The committee voted that same afternoon, 5-2 in favor of immediate official adoption. March 21, 1944, marked the day when the Grow vest officially transitioned from unauthorized field experiment to standard Army Air Force equipment, designated the M1 Flak vest in military documentation and technical manuals. Production orders went out immediately to manufacturers across the United States, with contracts for 100,000 units to be delivered by year's end. Malcolm Grow's gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, but the war's grinding arithmetic meant that validation came measured in saved lives rather than medals or recognition. The production expansion transformed vest manufacturing from a cottage operation into true industrial-scale output that could supply the entire bomber force. The Wilkinson Sword Company in England, which had been producing bayonets and edged weapons, converted entire production lines to steel, plate fabrication. The Firestone Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio, manufactured canvas backing using techniques they had developed for aircraft tire components. Assembly operations spread across 12 facilities in the United States and 4 in England, employing thousands of workers who understood they were producing armor that would bring someone's son or husband or brother home alive. The design continued evolving rapidly through direct combat feedback and field experience. Pilots requested additional side protection after several instances where fragments entering through shattered cockpit windows caused fatal wounds. Navigators needed vests specifically compatible with the severely cramped spaces of the nose compartment where they worked. Radio operators required modifications that didn't interfere with their equipment operation and the complex wiring surrounding their stations. Each variation was tested thoroughly in actual combat, refined based on results and crew feedback, and then incorporated into updated production specifications. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy and the strategic bombing campaign intensified dramatically to support ground operations, approximately 40% of 8th Air Force bomber crews flew with complete vest protection. The impact on casualty statistics was dramatic, undeniable, and unprecedented. Medical reports compiled by Grow's expanding surgical teams showed that fatal torso wound rates had declined by 78% among protected crews, compared to historical averages from 1943 missions. The statistics translated directly into human stories that rippled across America in letters home. Second Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a navigator from Iowa, survived a direct flak hit over Berlin that would have killed him instantly without protection. The fragment struck his vest with such tremendous force it cracked 2 ribs and left him unable to breathe normally for weeks. But Hansen has completed the complex navigation calculations required to bring his crippled bomber home safely to England. Staff Sergeant James Murphy, a ball turret gunner from Boston, took 4 separate hits during a raid on Munich. His vest stopped all 4 fragments, and Murphy continued firing his guns effectively until German fighters finally broke off their attack. These weren't exceptional cases that made headlines. They were becoming routine occurrences across hundreds of missions. Malcolm Grow spent the remainder of 1944 traveling constantly between bases, monitoring vest performance in combat, collecting detailed damage data, and continually refining the design based on real-world results. He aged visibly during those exhausting months. The weight of responsibility and the faces of men he couldn't save etched themselves into deep lines around his eyes. Friends and colleagues noticed he rarely smiled anymore, even when presented with compelling evidence of lives saved through his innovation. He attended too many military funerals for young men who might have survived with protection that arrived just weeks too late at their particular base. By war's end in May 1945, over 200,000 M1 flak vests had been produced and distributed throughout the European and Pacific theaters. Post-war casualty analysis, conducted by military medical researchers, concluded that the vest program saved approximately 8,000 American lives during the final 18 months of intensive air combat. 8,000 young men who survived missions they statistically should not have survived, who returned home when the fighting finally ended, who built families and careers and the entire post-war world. Staff Sergeant Paul Bradley, who had worn one of Grow's first crude experimental vests on the Stuttgart raid back in September 1943, completed his required 25-mission tour and rotated home to the United States in March 1945. He settled in California, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children who would simply never have existed without a determined surgeon's unauthorized innovation. Years later, Bradley donated his combat-worn vest to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where it remains on permanent display. A battered piece of steel and canvas that represents the precise difference between death and survival. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Grow received the Legion of Merit for his vest program, though the citation's bureaucratic language poorly captured the achievement's true significance and human impact. After the war ended, he returned to medical practice, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime innovation despite numerous requests for interviews. He understood instinctively that the true measure of success wasn't medals, recognition, or historical footnotes. It was in the thousands of men who lived full lives because someone had refused to accept that casualties were simply inevitable costs of warfare. The Grow vest evolved directly into the modern body armor that protects military personnel today across all services. Contemporary vests use advanced materials like Kevlar synthetic fibers and ceramic composite plates that would have seemed like science fiction in 1943. But the fundamental principle remains absolutely identical. Properly designed personal protection enhances combat effectiveness rather than undermining it. Every soldier, Marine, or airman wearing body armor in the 21st century benefits directly from the innovation that Malcolm Grow pioneered when he ignored official regulations and built protection in a salvage depot workshop because young men were dying. The broader legacy extends beyond equipment specifications to military culture itself. Grow demonstrated conclusively that innovation often comes from those closest to actual problems, not from distant bureaucracies operating on theoretical models. His willingness to bypass official channels when regulations directly conflicted with saving lives established precedents that military organizations still reference when justifying rapid adaptation during ongoing conflicts. The inherent tension between standardization and innovation, between following established procedures and solving immediate problems, plays out in every modern military crisis and reform effort. Malcolm Grow passed away in 1983 at the age of 82, having lived long enough to see his innovation become standard equipment across all military services worldwide. His obituary in the New York Times focused primarily on his distinguished medical career and various administrative positions, mentioning the Flak vest program only briefly in the final paragraphs. But among veterans who had flown through German flak at 25,000 feet over Europe, his legacy needed absolutely no elaboration or explanation. The vest had been all the introduction necessary to understand what he had accomplished. Today, visitors to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, can see preserved examples of the M1 Flak vest displayed alongside other World War II equipment in climate-controlled cases. The museum placards describe the vest's development timeline and statistical impact using sanitized language. But no exhibit can truly convey the desperation, innovation, and bureaucratic battles that brought this equipment into existence against institutional resistance. What the carefully curated displays cannot show is the 8,000 lives saved, the families that existed because fathers and sons came home, the vast ripple effects of one surgeon's absolute refusal to accept preventable deaths as acceptable. The story of Malcolm Grove's unauthorized steel vest represents a particular kind of heroism that rarely appears in war movies or popular histories, not the dramatic courage of combat against enemy fire, but the quieter, more difficult bravery of challenging institutional inertia and risking everything to do what's right. Malcolm Grove never flew dangerous combat missions, never personally engaged enemy fighters, never dropped bombs on strategic targets. His battlefield was entirely different. Workshops filled with salvaged steel and improvised tools, operating rooms where he desperately tried to repair what shrapnel destroyed, bureaucratic hearing rooms where cold statistics competed with the warm reality of human lives. In the end, his unauthorized steel vest saved thousands of young Americans because one determined man understood a fundamental truth that bureaucracies often forget. Regulations exist to support missions and protect people, not to obstruct them through institutional inertia. When the system fails to adequately protect those who serve, someone must have the moral courage to innovate despite the rules and potential consequences. Malcolm Grove was that someone, and the empty chairs at American family tables that might have been but weren't stand as the truest testimony to his legacy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.